were making pathways to their Isis and Osiris, their gods of afterlife and resurrection, and gods from their beginning.
The Egyptians emphatically believed in a golden age when the gods ruled the earth. 4 children came out of the womb of the sky goddess, 4 human-shaped children, 2 of which were Isis and Osiris. And they established a kingdom of the first time. They called it Zeptepi. This was a golden age when the gods ruled the earth and brought knowledge and civilization. The balance between the cosmos and the earth was perfect, and happiness ruled the land.
A golden time in which Osiris ruled. But Seth, his brother, grew jealous, betrayed and killed Osiris. The world fell prey to chaos as Seth cut up the body of Osiris and hid each of its 14 pieces. Blood and darkness came over Egypt. But Isis, faithful consort of Osiris, searched every corner of the land, gathered the parts of her beloved, and bound them in linen.
However, she could not find the phallus, and she fabricated a golden phallus from which she impregnated herself with the seed of Osiris and bore a son, the son Horus, the divine child. It is Horus that became the first established man-god, first pharaoh to rule Egypt. And all pharaohs that followed believed themselves to be reincarnated entities of Horus.
Horus with the falcon head avenged his father, conquered evil and slew Seth. And Isis and Osiris, reincarnated in heaven where both stand as rulers of the night and afterlife. Osiris as Orion and Isis as the star Sirius.
One cannot overemphasize the importance of the star Sirius. Sirius was Isis, the life-giving force of Egypt. The star performs a very, very specific cycle. It is not only the brightest star in the northern hemisphere, in the whole sky. It wasn't because the star was beautiful and brilliant that the Egyptian venerated it, but it would disappear. Orion and Sirius would disappear for a period of 70 days. Now this is extremely interesting because the period of 70 days was also the period of embalmment. When they would mummify a king, they would take 70 days to perform the ritual. And therefore it's clear that they associated it to the disappearance of the stars for 70 days. 70 days they waited in mourning and in expectation and in fear that the star would not reappear and Egypt would not be reborn again. But then on a magical day that occurred at the summer solstice, 70 days later, the star would pop over the eastern horizon this time at dawn, just a few seconds before sunrise. And this sparkle, this spark of life, of the appearance of the star, was the greatest moment in the Egyptian cultic belief.
For at that same moment, the river Nile swelled from monsoon rains in a distant, unknown south. The Nile floods brought new life to a parched land. For Egypt, this was the yearly rebirth, so crucial that it took it as the start of its new year.
This miraculous conjunction of summer solstice sunrise, of the rebirth of Sirius at dawn, after this long invisibility, and the flooding of the Nile, was the great vision that the Egyptians had about rebirth. And they imagined their god Osiris in the sky, looking down on his creation, looking down on Egypt, looking down at the rising of the star. And the creation that he sees is not only the star rising, but the rebirth of Egypt. And this spark of life was, in their mind, transferable to the goddess Isis giving birth to Horus, the divine child which represented Egypt. So it is the star that encapsulates the very essence of Egypt, the very essence of its yearly rebirth. Now, here we have a divine mother bearing the divine child associated to a star in the east. Interestingly, the same concept appears again 3,000 years later in a completely new cult. Or is it a completely new cult?
Beauval's insights shed new light on the magical death rites for the pharaoh, child of Horus, as the builders of the pyramids envisaged. After 70 days, the mummy was taken west to the land across the Nile, the Giza necropolis. As one crosses the Milky Way to Orion's belt, where the pyramids stand as the gateway to Isis and Osiris, gods of life after death.
I'm taking you inside the Pyramid of Unas. Here are the oldest religious writings in history, the pyramid texts. The meaning of these texts were nearly forgotten because Egyptologists saw in them mainly a sun religion. But this isn't a religion of the day and the living. This is a religion of the night and of the dead. These texts repeatedly tell us that the king becomes a star in the kingdom of Osiris, in the constellation of Orion. One of these texts says, "May you traverse the winding waterway, the Milky Way, and may you go to the place where Orion is." Now, when a pharaoh died, his body was mummified and prepared like Osiris, and his soul was ready to ascend to the sky. But before this would happen, the dead king had to ensure that the power of divine rule was passed on to his son, the living Horus. This would happen in a very dramatic ceremony called the opening of the mouth, during which ceremonial tools were used to open the mouth of the mummy and bring it back to life. Then an artificial phallus was placed on the mummy, and the dead king was directed towards the star of Isis, the star Sirius. It was then that the seeding of the womb of the goddess took place. His earthly mission fulfilled, and the dead king would depart to the sky. In effect, what we have here is a reenactment of the resurrection myth of Osiris, told in stellar terms.
In ancient Egypt, this was Rostal, entrance to the underworld, kingdom of Osiris and gateway to afterlife, a place where mystery reigns, up until today.
We found remains of 4 pillars like this one. In between there is water, underneath the water there is the sarcophagus, above the sarcophagus was that lid. When I looked inside the sarcophagus, we did not find anything. But why? He's not buried here, but symbolically he's a spirit. His spirit is here. They could know that this is the tomb of Osiris. And this really is a symbolic burial, a cenotaph for Osiris. And it's very unique. And it became legend later that many people will be having a small statue made of wood and then erection in it, and they mummify this, and erection means resurrection, because Osiris is the god of resurrection. He was killed by the devil Seth, but Isis cried her tear with the river Nile, and she restored his erection that she could not find, and she had the son from him, Horus the victorious, who conquered the devil. This myth built the Egyptian civilization. Without Isis, there is no river Nile. The river Nile gave fertility to the land. Without the river Nile, there is no Egypt. And also, the story tells us the devil always has to be conquered.
Much more than tombs for dead pharaohs, this was the grandiose expression of a civilization with a cosmic vision that probed death and reached for resurrection through magical rites and initiation.
The whole focus of the Egyptian cult, the whole idea of the initiatory cult, of the mystical cult, is to learn how to perform this transfiguration and journey into the afterlife and become part of the Osirian afterlife kingdom. Osiris was the constellation of Orion. They called this Sahu. Strangely enough, the name Sahu means to become a spiritual being, an astral being. They gave the name to the mummy. We have named mummies mummies, but the mummy in ancient Egypt was called Sahu. To become a Sahu is to become a mummy, but it's also to become a spiritualized entity, to become Orion. The same way we say to join Christ, or to become Christ-like after death.
Are the Giza pyramids an attempt to reach beyond death? New insights gain ground.
They were an actual model on the ground of the region of the sky through which your soul is expected to travel. So they were a place of initiation.
Nicaea 325 AD. Constantine, the first Roman emperor to embrace Christianity, has called the bishops. As a statesman, he opts for orthodoxy and the support of a powerful hierarchy.
Fellow ministers, we believe in one God.
What he decrees will define the Christian faith until today.
Invisible, and in one Lord, Jesus Christ, the Son of God, begotten from the Father, God from
The
God.
Gnostic Gospels burned. Christians kill fellow Christians by countless thousands. Gnostics and everything pagan are wiped out. The Serapeum, Alexandria's temple of Osiris, and its great library go up in flames.
And what replaced the system of knowledge and gnosis was blind faith, which eventually led to the monks and ascetic and dryness of an establishment that imposed their doctrines and dogmas on the population. We're now at the most incredible crossroad of world culture. Here is Filat, where the last stand of Egyptian culture and Egyptian religion stands, the great temple of Isis. But the Christian mobs finally make their way here with their hammers and their chisels, and they throw themselves on what they consider to be the pagan image and starts chiseling. And the priests beg them, stop, stop, this is the most sacred temple of Egypt. This is the temple of the Mother Goddess. Thousands of years, your Mother Goddess. You have a Mother Goddess. You have your own. And they begged the monks to take over this temple and use it as a Christian sanctuary. And here we have it all. In a desperate bid to save the cult of Isis, the Egyptian priests stepped aside and let the new religion absorb its iconography and symbols.
At the close of antiquity, last survivors entrust the Gnostic Gospels and the ancient philosophies to paper and hide it for their persecutors. The Gnostic religious texts have surfaced only recently. The philosophical texts emerge much earlier in Florence, cradle of Europe's reawakening.
In 1460, a monk delivered to Cosimo de' Medici a bundle of books. They turned out to be the Hermetica, the lost works of Hermes Trismegistus, the Egyptian thought. Cosimo asked his translator, Marsilio Ficino, to put aside Plato and translate forthwith the Hermetica. An intellectual bomb was about to explode. Hermetism became so popular that even the Pope Borgia decorated his apartments at the Vatican with scenes of Osiris and Isis and thought Hermes as imagined by the Renaissance painters. Here a religion was insinuating itself that was ordered and deemed by some wiser than that of Moses. in the Bible.
The Cathedral of Siena shows this image of Hermes Trismegistus, the god Thot, handing over Egypt's wisdom, and the phoenix of creation and ancient Heliopolis. The popes sprinkle Rome with symbols of antiquity and obelisks from Egypt.
By a strange twist of fate, the Pope chose the ancient symbol of Heliopolis, which was a pillar and a cross on top of it, and placed it in the very heart of Christendom. And how ironic that all who come here also admire this symbol of pagan Egypt.
Scholars like the Jesuit Athanasius Kircher study the Egyptian enigmas, but the Church senses danger. Hermeticism inspires new individual ways, away from the interests of the Church. Ideas are banned, books burnt. In 1600, Hermeticism is silenced, as its main proponent, Gordiano Bruno, is dragged before ecclesiastical courts and, despite cruel torture, refuses to renounce his ideas.
The Church had only one way to stop this, and so the unthinkable happened. On a dull September morning, Giordano Bruno was dragged to this place, his mouth gagged, and he was burnt alive. Up to the very last moment, he tried to avert his eyes from the cross that was being brandished to his face by the Inquisition priests. And with this, Hermetism took a nosedive and went deep underground.
Hermeticism finds refuge in esoteric societies such as Rosicrucians or Freemasonry. The Grand Lodge of London, heart and headquarters of Freemasonry, resonates with ancient symbols. Initiation in secrets, rites and symbols. Ask any Freemason about links with ancient Egypt, and they'll probably laugh it off. Authors Bob Lomas and Chris Knight would have done just that, until curiosity got the better of them.
10 years ago, we would have poo-pooed anybody that said what we're saying now. But it's not a straight, linear event, but there is a line straight back to Egypt that merged and branched off and rebranched back.
The pyramid with the all-seeing eye, the blazing star, did Egypt's most sacred symbols find their way in Masonic mysteries? In their books, Lomas and Knight investigate the influence of Freemasonry on symbols and institutions of America.
The founders of the United States of America, the majority of them, George Washington, Franklin and others, were Freemasons. At the construction of the White House, they attended there in all their Masonic regalia. And the Constitution of the United States is an extension of the principles of Freemasonry, of democracy and the investment in science and the furtherance of science. It's a Masonic experiment, which in turn is an ancient Egyptian experiment, the principle of doing good for goodness sake, and outside of a religion. And that's what Freemasonry is today.
In front of the George Washington Masonic Temple stands another familiar symbol. Here, Washington and other founding fathers are honored carrying a Mason's apron. The dollar, symbol of America's might, shows the unknown side of the American seal, the pyramid with the all-seeing eye and the promise of a new order.
It's interesting, for example, that when the president is sworn in, he makes a Masonic symbol, which I can't demonstrate because it would contravene my vows as a Freemason. He doesn't explain what it is, but he makes a symbol, and that symbol is the Masonic symbol of fidelity.
So this man also didn't do it just to keep his fingers warm. Napoleon stepped on the world scene as conqueror of Egypt.
When Napoleon came to the gates of Cairo, he did not come as a Christian. He and his army were much imbued with a revolutionary cult that was modeled on Masonic ideals.
Virtually all his generals were Freemasons, and Napoleon himself was initiated during a night he passed alone inside the Great Pyramid.
Napoleon, when he returned from Egypt, was obsessed with the idea that he was under the protection of a star. So much so that this monument, known as the Place de l'Étoile, the Place of the Star, was put
along the central axis of Paris, the Champs-Élysées, and more.
This great artery of Paris lies 26 degrees off east to align it with the Star of Isis, Beauval believes.
This is what the Parisians would see when they looked east, the constellation of Orion rising, and here's the star Sirius just breaking over the horizon, 26.5 degrees to the right of east, in perfect alignment with the axis of the Champs-Élysées.
Some historians say that the name of Paris may be linked to the goddess Isis, because here, where stands the church of Saint-Germain-des-Prés, once stood the temple of Isis. And the Romans used to call this place Par-Isis, which means near the temple of Isis. Par-Isis, Paris.
Napoleon was impressed enough to order the star and Isis herself placed on the prow of this ship in the emblem of Paris. The city harbors many references to Isis and Egypt, as on this ceiling of the Louvre Palace. It shows the genius of Paris to whom the future is unveiled. From the Middle Ages rises the myth of the Holy Grail. King Arthur and his Round Table. Was there something like a grail, symbol for the church or for opponents which it feared? Peoples and gods of the Andes. How could the mightiest empire of its time fall for a handful of Spanish conquerors? The secret of the Incas and the lost war against time. The Golem, the secrets of Kabbalah, Jewish myth, or man's longing to shape life and imitate the act of God. Ark of the Covenant, embodiment of God. Its sudden disappearance is one of the greatest mysteries from the Bible. Is the Ark still somewhere? From a nightmare arose a monster, Dracula.
How dare you touch him? That man belongs to me!
How from fantasy and frustration, author Bram Stoker created a being which would become a myth.
May traverse the Milky Way.
Osiris, Isis, Horus, the quest for eternity and life after death, prototype for Christianity? The myths of ancient Egypt still reverberate today.
Hail the Supreme Sovereign, the Emperor Constantine, and the Empress Helena!
The year is 324. Constantine, the first emperor to embrace Christianity, has summoned the bishops to put an end to fierce theological debate.
There must have been a time before his creation when he was not heretic.
3 centuries after Jesus of Nazareth walked the earth, quarrel rages about who and what he was. The decision the emperor imposes will define Christianity for 18 centuries to come.
Supreme Sovereign, fellow ministers, this is the creed to which we have unanimously declared ourselves signatories. We believe in one God, the Father Almighty, maker of all things visible and invisible, and in one Lord, Jesus Christ, the Son of God, begotten from the Father, light from light, true God from true God, begotten, not made.
By imperial decree, Jesus of Nazareth is proclaimed to be God's only Son. All other opinions are suppressed. Those disagreeing are exterminated.
The Dead Sea Scrolls speak of sons of God in a plural way. They are the perfect, and they are the people who are perfectly carrying out the law.
How would the historic Jesus have felt if he would have known that he would be termed the divine Son of God and only one?
I think he would have been horrified, completely horrified. It's the very opposite of everything that he would or could have represented in the Palestine that we're talking about.
10 years ago, historian Robert Eisenman forced the Dead Sea Scrolls into the open. Discovered in 1945 by a wandering shepherd, these documents offer a unique view on the world into which Jesus would be born. For the scrolls, Israel built this Shrine of the Book. Robert Eisenman found himself alone in his conclusion that they talk about Jesus, and that the man we see as God's son might have been a rebel-rouser and fanatic. He is now virtually ignored. But fewer contested the words he then spoke at the end of a documentary I made on the scrolls, and for 10 years they kept on puzzling me. Who was Jesus? What was he?
Jesus was a Jew for all his life. He was born a Jew, he died a Jew. I think he would have been amazed at the construction of a Christian church.
Well, if we discovered this text today, that here was a guy who was born of a virgin, his mother was God, and he walked on water and then came back from the dead, we would all go, well, this is clearly a myth. And yet, because it's so much a part of our culture, part of our education, part of our upbringing, we call it the unthinkable thought. To think that this might actually be a myth is beyond most of us.
There was a biblical scholar, and probably a very devout Christian, writing at the beginning of the century, who said, we should no longer hope that the Jesus who actually lived in Palestine has any resemblance at all to the Jesus of the Bible. And I think that was a brutally honest statement, and probably a correct statement.
For those who take the Bible as the very word of God, it may save pain and aggravation to turn this program off. It explores the thought that the creed stems from the realm of myth instead. A conviction growing among scholars as ancient documents come to light, which give new insight in the origins of Christianity. Son of God was not just a term reserved for the pious and knowledgeable, also for the powerful. In ancient Egypt, every pharaoh was a son of Osiris, son of God.
You take Alexander the Great. Now, he is the person who brought the whole Mediterranean world together into a Greek empire. Now, his mother was an initiate of the cult of Dionysus. She groomed him with the idea that he was an immaculate conception, that born from the god. And in his life...
She was the Virgin Mother.
Indeed.
Julius Caesar is the son of the goddess, with divine lineage, as all emperors later came to claim. So the idea of being son of God is quite commonplace throughout the ancient world.
Did Jesus himself ever call himself the Son of God?
So far as we know, Jesus never referred to himself as Son of God. If we believe the Gospel of Mark, he spoke of himself as Son of Man.
Deep in his 80s, Dutchman Gilles Quispel, once professor at Harvard, is still considered one of the world's most eminent experts on ancient and early Christian thought.
The deceased appears for the tribunal of the last balance. And the man is standing there before the door that gives entrance to the hall of absolute truth. And there stands also Osiris.
He is a god who appears on the earth as a man. He brings great teachings, the proper way to worship the gods, brings civilization in a way, and then is put to death by the forces of evil. He is resurrected. He then ascends into heaven, where he will be the judge of souls at the end of time. And Egyptian tombs are full of representations of these events.
For ancient Egypt, Osiris stood as the constellation of Orion, good shepherd amongst the stars, souls in heaven. It is by no means the only mythic image that foretold the later concepts of Christianity. Authors Tim Freak and Peter Gandy made extensive study into ancient thought. It's a crude image. Why did you put this in front of your book?
Well, this piece of evidence was hugely important for us. It's a talisman, an amulet. It's tiny, the size of my thumb. and it shows what you think is Jesus on the cross. And yet the Greek inscription tells us that it's the pagan, dying and resurrecting God-man Dionysus. And the discovery that the pagan God-man could have met his death in exactly the same way that Jesus was later claimed to have died, for us was conclusive evidence that the Jesus story as we have it is taken from pagan mythology.
It says Bacchus, wasn't he the god of wine?
Indeed, indeed, but also the god of initiation.
Originally no more than a minor wine deity, Dionysus, literally God's son, later transforms into a redeemer. A divine child, seated in eerie resemblance to the infant Christ on his mother's lap. He is honored with bread and wine to commemorate his sacrifice and death on a crude stake. He resurrects and ascends to heaven, a Greek version of Osiris. Could Christianity owe something to this ancient culture and others?
On the site where the Vatican now stands, there once stood a pagan temple. Here, pagan priests celebrated sacred ceremonies which early Christians found so disturbing that they tried to erase all evidence of them ever having been practiced.
What were these shocking pagan rites? Gruesome sacrifices? Obscene orgies, perhaps? This is what we've been led to believe, but the truth is far stranger than this fiction.
In this ancient sanctuary, pagan congregations once glorified a redeemer, Mithras, who, like Jesus, was born on the 25th of December, of a virgin, the Son of God, who ascended into heaven and promised to come again at the end of time to judge the quick and the dead. Here, pagan priests celebrated a symbolic meal of bread and wine in honor of their Redeemer, the blood of Christ, who promised to his followers that he who shall not drink of my blood shall not know salvation.
Like Osiris in Egypt, Mithras, a deity with origins in Persia, stood in the skies as Orion, facing Taurus. His cult became the prime competitor of Christianity in the ancient world.
One famous scholar said that if Christianity hadn't triumphed, the whole world would have been Mithraic. Here is a deity who is a divine savior. He's the son of God and a mortal woman.
He's God incarnate. He brings wisdom. He brings a new religion. He challenges, as the mystics always do, the old authorities. He's outrageous. He performs miracles. He turns water into wine at a wedding, just as Jesus does. He dies at Easter. He resurrects after 3 days. He ascends to heaven. And we've got lovely inscriptions saying, if you share in the blood and the body of the God-man, then you too will be resurrected. So the motifs which we associate with the story of Jesus already exist in the story of Osiris Dionysus somewhere.
How do Christian authors, early Christian authors, explain away these similarities?
Well, there's two approaches. The early literalist Christians explain this through diabolical mimicry or plagiarism by anticipation. It's the idea that somehow the devil has taken these ideas, because he knows they're going to happen, made up these myths over the centuries to mess with people's heads, so that when it actually happens in the form of Jesus, no one will believe it. Now, that's what the literalist Christians are saying. These Christians we don't actually find until the 2nd century.
Christians celebrated their victory by claiming and pretending that paganism was decaying, crude, uninteresting, inferior, and that Christianity simply had to win. But that was a Christian fantasy. In fact, paganism was passionately alive.
And what does pagan itself mean?
Well, it was coined by the Christians as a term of abuse. It means country dweller. So it was to suggest that these people who had built the pyramids, had given us the plays of Euripides and Sophocles, the works of Plato, were in some way primitive, superstitious country folk.
What transformed your opinion of paganism?
I think studying pagan spirituality and discovering this rich, mystical philosophy at the heart of it, this is where much that is of the best of what we now regard as Western culture comes from these roots, and finding that this form of spirituality wasn't at all this very primitive idol worship. It was incredibly sophisticated.
Catacombs. The images seem early Christian, but this good shepherd is in fact the redeemer god Attis from Greek Asia.
Although the Christian message may seem revolutionary, to love your enemies, and it is a far cry from the Judaic teachings of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, but in pagan philosophy we have sentiments that the philosopher's way is to be flogged like an ass and to love the man who beats you, to be a brother and a father to all mankind.
The polytheism or the monotheism, these really are not the issues. It blinds you to the real perspective. It's how they're understood which is crucial.
How did the ancients try to understand the mystery of life? Most is lost, destroyed, but crucial seem to be ideas, also voiced by the Greek thinker Plato. Man, said Plato, is like someone in a cave, bound, unable to see anything else than what is before his eyes, vague shapes on the wall. Shadows that the light casts from the real world that goes on behind him.
Is there one thing?
But man, unable to turn, blind to a real, divine world, keeps on staring at the wall before him, thinking that truth is there, believing that only that is his reality. Learning to see that true divine world was the quest of the mystery religions.
Mystery religion aims at transformation. That is the basic idea of the mystery.
They sought to transform, to see true reality, true knowledge, what they called gnosis.
All the mystery religions really had an outer, exoteric, outer mysteries and inner mysteries, more mystical teachings about self-transformation. And the outer mysteries really are there for, they talk about cooking for the masses, you know, it's something which is available to all.
But others saw a deeper, mystical reality under the surface of the story. To them the story was an allegory which told not just about the god, but beyond that, about themselves. A deeper message which taught them to understand the mystery of life and face the reality of death.
And then what we find then is a spectrum between two extremes, which we call literalists on the one hand, or Gnostics and mystics on the other. That the Gnostics, or the mystics, pagan philosophers, you know, they're attacking their own literalists or fundamentalists who literally believe that worshipping an idol will help you and all the rest of it. They're going, no, this is a complete misunderstanding. We're saying that there is an essential mystical understanding of the miracle and the mystery of life, and the language with which this is expressed varies. Now, one of the ways that it's expressed is allegory, in mythic picture language and stories. And the one which is key, of course, to understanding Christianity is the myth of the Son of God. And that goes right the way back to the ancient Egyptians and Osiris and develops up through figures such as Dionysus in Greece, Attis, Adonis, Mithras, and so forth. Many, many different figures. What we would say is that exactly the same process then continued right the way through up until the 1st century, where the Jews did exactly the same thing and took their mythic figure, the Messiah, Joshua, Jesus, and transformed him likewise into this dying and resurrecting God-man.
To his companions, Jesus of Nazareth was a man who taught the deepest truth. Were they agnostics? Mystics who fit his life and death into a Gnostic framework? Did Jesus become their symbol for a deeper message, an inner truth?
A figure in an allegory through which you can be transformed through initiation, and that at the end of that you can come to gnosis, or knowledge, this mystical state of enlightenment.
Belief in the Jesus story was originally only a first step in Christian spirituality, the outer mystery. The significance was to be explained by an enlightened teacher when the student was spiritually ripe, a mystical knowledge of God beyond mere dogma. Although there are many great Christian mystics of later centuries who have intuitively seen through to this deeper symbolic level, as a culture we've kept only the outer mysteries. It seems to me we have kept the form, but we have lost the meaning.
The only contemporary to write about him is the historian Josephus, and then only a few words, which may have been even inserted much later. The Bible describes Jesus in most extensive detail, but the Gospels seem to vary and even contradict. Take the crucial moment when his believers hear the Lord has resurrected. Mark reports a man in white announcing it to 3 women. Luke has 3 men and 3 women encounter 2 angels. In Matthew, 2 women see 1 angel. And in John, only Mary Magdalena sees 2 angels.
There's no consensus, even within the New Testament, on the form of the resurrection. In the late 2nd century, some argued that you had to believe not only that Jesus was somehow alive, but that it was actually a physical, corporeal resuscitation of his body. And that conviction has been enshrined in the creeds, but it's not part of the early Christian movement. It's very hard to speak about the historical Jesus, but the Gospels, they weren't written for that purpose, of course. They're not historical writings. They're written in the form of biography. But their purpose is not to tell us about the historical Jesus. It's to tell us about their convictions that this man was God's Messiah, and to persuade us of that by all means possible. And so they are religious teachings, not historical writings.
The Gospels are books of belief constructed to sound as though they're history. And the historicity of Jesus is a core element in the appeal to truth. Here I'm telling you a true story. But it's highly unlikely that the Gospels are contemporary records. The Gospels were written in the cities of the Eastern Mediterranean.
And in Greek, by educated men, not by the fishermen who are recorded as the followers of Jesus in the Gospels.
And they were written decades after Christ, when the memory of his life and suffering was fading, around a time which came as a watershed, the Jewish rising and total destruction of Israel by Rome, annihilating anyone who might still have known Jesus himself. Mark, Luke, and Matthew wrote their Gospels almost 2 generations after Jesus. The 4th, John's Gospel, came even almost 3 generations later, and they weren't the only Gospels.
We know that there were many, many Gospels that followers of Jesus read, wrote, revered, and many other writings too. Letters, epistles, poems, hymns, and so forth. Today we look at Christianity and it looks very diverse. Everything from Baptist to Russian Orthodox to Calvinist, Roman Catholic, an enormous range. But when you look at the 1st century, probably the range was even greater because there was no fixed canon of New Testament scriptures. There was no creed. that was agreed upon by Christians throughout the world, and there was no specific structure. So what strikes me as fascinating is that the groups one sees as Christian are, if anything, more diverse than they are today.
Jesus, his companions and first followers were Jews, Judaic Christians. What these original Christians, closest to the teachings of Jesus, thought has for many centuries been obscured, but now ancient documents have appeared which shed light on their beliefs. Gilles Quispel played a crucial role in opening them up to science, and what they reveal is stunning.
The Judaic Christians were silent about the saving value of the sacrifice of Christ on the cross. There is no virginal birth, no resurrection, no cross, but only just the words of Jesus, who is there, the embodiment of divine wisdom.
A holy man, not a god, but a man of profoundest wisdom.
They believed that Jesus was an enlightened enlightener.
The Spirit of God descended on him as the Spirit descended on the prophets of old. And he became a person inspired by the Spirit. And at that point, a voice from heaven proclaimed him to be God's chosen one, in fact, his son.
Divine insight came on Jesus when he was a man. To many Christians who cling to divine birth and the dogma of Immaculate Conception, it may come as a surprise that Jesus, in fact, had brothers.
The Gospel of Mark tells us that Jesus had brothers and sisters who were well known in their hometown. And I think later Christians became troubled by this. So they were taken to be the children of Joseph by a previous marriage. However, the Gospel of Mark suggests nothing of the kind.
Jerusalem, this Armenian cathedral, was built over the remains of one of Jesus' brothers, James, though the church prefers not to call him that.
This is a sanctuary in the name of Saint James, the brother of the Lord, who was a cousin to Jesus by Joseph, and he was the first bishop of Jerusalem, and his remnant was under the main altar.
Lately, this small sandstone coffin has come to light, marked James, son of Joseph, brother of Joshua, Jesus. Through this brother, one realizes something crucial about Jesus, for James was a key figure in Jerusalem of the time.
James, the brother of Jesus, was the leader of the Jesus movement from the death of Jesus until 61. There's only one very brief paragraph in the historian Josephus writing at the end of the 1st century about the death of James. And it says quite clearly that a wildcat Sadducee high priest assassinated James and was removed from his position as high priest by the majority of the priests who objected, by the Pharisees, who were the friends of James, the brother of Jesus. It is quite extraordinary, because in this account, the Pharisees are on the side of the Jesus movement, not, as they're reported in the Gospels, as the enemies. So for 25 years or so, the Jesus movement is a acknowledged Jewish movement associated with fervent Jews worshipping at the temple. And it's the destruction of the temple in 70 which knocks out the heart of the Jewish Jesus movement. But until then, most Christians, in my book, were Jews.
Jews who would found their Messiah. All Jews hoped for the coming of a holy man, a Messiah. God would help with heavenly hosts to liberate the people of Israel from foreign oppression. But Jesus was a different Messiah. He taught that salvation can be found within oneself.
The Gospel of Thomas suggests that Jesus is the illuminated one. Like a Buddha, he is the enlightened one, not different from anyone else, but one who has realized the deepest potential, the spiritual potential of human nature.
Yes, according to the Jewish Christians, yes. But if you say that sounds like the enlightenment of Buddha, I would say that you are right. I would say Jesus is, for me as a Christian, the light of the world. But the concept of an enlightened man is the same.
A man of deepest wisdom, enlightened, but a man, no God. A son of God to Jews as they considered other holy men. At what point then was he iconized into God's only begotten Son? Declared dogma when the creed was formalized by Constantine 300 years later.
We believe in one Lord, Jesus Christ, the Son of God, begotten from the Father, God from God, light from light, true God from true God, begotten, not made.
Of the four Gospels in the New Testament, of course, the latest to be written was the Gospel of John. And the Gospel of John is the only one that speaks of Jesus as a divine being, as himself divine, as God in human form, and particularly as the only begotten Son of God. It's quite a remarkable and radical view that one man was God incarnate. And startlingly, that unusual gospel, which actually in the early Christian movement I cannot find mentioned among Orthodox Christians before about the year 160, becomes the lens through which Christians later read all the Gospels. So many Christians today will think, well, of course, Christianity means Jesus is the Son of God. But that's not what you find in Matthew, Mark, or Luke so much. You find in those the teaching that Jesus is God's Messiah, the one who redeems his people, the one who teaches the way of righteousness. One could be a very devout Jew and follow Jesus at that point. But with the Gospel of John, the claim that Jesus is God's Son, and more than that, his only Son, that radical claim in the Gospel of John changes the understanding of the Christian message in a dramatic way.
Rising debate over the nature of Jesus, whether a man or divine, transforms early Christianity as the movement widens. A growing belief in the messenger more than the message. It may have changed Christianity more profoundly than the change brought about by another man who is usually seen as the great divide. Paul.
Paul was retrospectively constructed as the hero who refounded the Christian church. But Paul always tried to recruit believers in the synagogue. Very sensible too. Then the Jews knew half the story. But he was also willing to recruit Gentiles. The radical break that Paul made was to allow non-Jews to eat with Jews and not follow kosher laws. And that was a radical break, to be inclusive, to allow everyone to believe in Jesus. It was a fantastic step.
Paul is a completely misconceived character in history. Paul is, at the time of Paul, we would say that there is no split between Gnosticism and literalism because literalism hasn't developed. There is no literal Jesus at this time.
Paul is existing before the literal story. He's writing before the gospel, and Paul doesn't have a gospel story. Paul's Christology is very, very unique and very spiritual.
Paul amazingly, he says that he received his teaching from a revelation in which a being of light appeared to him, and he was convinced it was Jesus. He knew little about him, but then
talks about Jesus.
he doesn't talk about Jesus, and he says if once we knew Jesus according to the flesh, that doesn't matter anymore now. What matters is the risen Christ.
Paul says that Christ was revealed
in me, not to me.
What does that mean?
When he's talking, yes, I mean, this is fascinating. If he's talking about, you know, his vision of light, he doesn't meet the Jesus that we're familiar with from the gospel story, who had a mother and father, and all of that is not important to Paul. What he meets is a being of light, just as exactly the pagans had met their gods as beings of light. And then when he talks about the great secret that has been revealed, is not that Jesus came, was born just down the road and did all these miraculous things. What he says is, this is the great secret, Christ in you. And when he talks about Christ being revealed, it wasn't revealed to him, Christ was revealed in him. Now this is what makes Paul's Christianity so completely Gnostic and not literal.
What would true mean? Because the literalist approach is that Jesus is outside of you, God is outside of you, God is outside of the universe indeed. It's separate. Whereas the Gnostic approach and the ancient pagan approach of the mysteries is that all is one. If you could put it in a nutshell, it's just that. All is one. And so Christ is in you, you are in Christ. You can say it either way you like, but you can't divide it up. And that's what the literalist church does.
How different the writings of Paul are becomes steadily more obvious through the sensational discovery of a hoard of documents, unknown gospels, hidden when a Christian church on the rise persecuted their readers. Gnostic gospels, discovered half a century ago in Nag Hammadi, Egypt. Misunderstood, maltreated at first, fallen into the hands of black traders, scientists now realize what they imply.
The books from Nag Hammadi are more important than the Dead Sea Scrolls, because they throw a new light on the history of Christianity, on Jesus, and on God. Didymus Judas Thomas, our Patschaftje.
By far the most important gospel was written by a Didymus Judas Thomas.
Who was Didymus Judas Thomas? Didymus Judas Thomas was one of the brothers of Jesus.
Later church tradition makes of Thomas the apostle who could not believe Jesus after his death came back in the flesh, resurrected as a physical body, wounds, stigmata, and all.
The doubting Thomas, who is now said to be the most faithful disciple of his master.
Who best understood his brother.
According to the Gospel of Thomas, yes.
The document ascribed to Thomas, though written down later, is now believed to go back before the canonized Gospels, and is thought to reflect closely the time when the teachings of Jesus were fresh and alive.
I find it astonishing, really, that the Christians haven't run out everywhere and wanting to read the Gospel of Thomas and all these other marvelous scriptures which have come to light. And I think it says something about how powerful the hold of the Roman Church was, that it's still pushed outside, they're still regarded as heretical and dangerous. And of course they are. They are heretical and they are dangerous from the perspective of the literalist church, because they turn the understanding of the literalist church inside out.
In many ways, if you read it, it's like having a bath in 1,000 soap bubbles and getting the soap into your eyes. It's blinding, it's obscuring, as well as cleansing.
It was already there in the Egyptian religion, when they said 3,000 before Christ that man, after his life, became Osiris. He was integrated into the Godhead. It was the basic concept of all mysteries that existed in the Roman Hellenistic world. The mysteries of Isis, of Mithras, of Adonis, everything. That was the idea. There was in man a divine spark hidden unconsciously in him, and that was to be awakened by the initiation which led ultimately to transformation.
How did it get lost?
Well, that is very simple. The Catholics had the bulldozer, and the rabbis had the bulldozer too. And that summarizes in a few words the whole history of Christianity and Judaism.
From the Middle Ages rises the myth of the Holy Grail, King Arthur and his Round Table. Was there something like a Grail, symbol for the Church or for opponents which it feared? Peoples and gods of the Andes. How could the mightiest empire of its time fall for a handful of Spanish conquerors? The secret of the Incas and the lost war against time. The Golem, the secrets of Kabbalah, Jewish myth, or man's longing to shape life and imitate the act of God. Ark of the Covenant, embodiment of God. Its sudden disappearance is one of the greatest mysteries from the Bible. Is the Ark still somewhere? From a nightmare arose a monster, Dracula.
How dare you touch him? That man belongs to me.
How from fantasy and frustration, author Bram Stoker created a being which would become a myth. May traverse the Milky Way. Osiris, Isis, Horus, the quest for eternity and life after death, prototype for Christianity? The myths of ancient Egypt still reverberate today. Brought a crucial new element into the relationship between man and the divine: sin.
The central element in the Christian message, its lever, is the degree to which it instills guilt, that God is there watching, knowing not only what we do, but what we think. I think Christianity is quite exceptional in the degree to which the all-seeing God observes and punishes, is said to punish, believers for faults of thought, for sins of the mind.
Sin and guilt gave rise to a creed in which hell became imaginable, fear of God, and admonishments of priests. It was not an idea the Gnostics wished to share.
The word sinner doesn't figure in their dictionary.
The Gospel of Thomas speaks not so much of the discontinuity between God and ourselves, but of humans created in the divine image, and therefore having a sort of innate connectedness, affinity with the divine.
Man is a fallen God that remembers heaven. That is the concept of all mysteries of antiquity and also of gnosis. The word sin doesn't find a place.
That doesn't mean, of course, that we're sinless or divine, but rather that we can find our way to God when we find our way to ourselves. And for what sins we commit or what wrongs we do, there are means of redress.
But to make sin so essential that Jesus had to die to redeem us, argument focused on an ancient myth, Adam and Eve, and the first sin which made man mortal.
Christians dwell upon the sinfulness of Eve, the wicked woman, much more than Jews do.
Before Orthodox Christianity, sin hadn't been such an issue. Jewish rabbis, pagans, Gnostic teachers basically agreed that we have in us the capacity to follow or to disobey God.
We have the good impulse and the evil impulse. And that was understood to be a human condition.
There's a great debate about it, because some Christians thought it was crazy. This is eating an apple, one minor disobedience, and for that, millennia of Christians are condemned by God to an inferior existence rather than living in paradise. It's a completely disproportionate punishment.